Welcome. It's exciting to be doing this finally. Ryan and I actually have been talking about doing this for a while, Pastor White and I. I'm doing a little bit of a podcast and interviewing people on different issues that we all face. And COVID has sort of driven us to our knees, and we're finally doing probably what we should have been doing a long time ago. And one of the reasons we wanted to do a podcast, I enjoy preaching, I love preaching, but I also realize that there are a lot of topics that aren't really conducive. They're not easily tackled from the pulpit. And when it comes to having personal devotions, I can give tips from a pulpit, but a classroom setting is a little bit, more conducive to learning the ins and outs and the nuts and bolts. Preaching, in my opinion, I'm a little bit more persuasive when I preach. When I teach, I feel like I fill in the blank space and the gaps. And so what we're hoping to do through this podcast is begin to address some life issues. I've had people talk to me, how do I have devotions? Or how do I pray? How do I read my Bible? Can you give me some pointers for my marriage? What about parenting? And so we've got a lot of things lined up. We're excited about doing here at the church, and Ryan will be joining me in the future. But this first podcast we wanted to do on parenting, and I didn't think it'd be appropriate for Ryan and I to be together for that. So what we're doing today, I'm pretty excited about this. I have my pastor and his wife, Mr. and Mrs. Lormer, here with us. And that's pretty special for me. And I think it's more, I think it's more special for me now that I'm a pastor and I preach to people and love on people. And so in kind of a weird way, I think it'd be really cool if sometimes somebody called me in the future that used to be in my church. And so I've been looking forward to this for what we've been talking about, doing a podcast. And then I contacted them last week. And so I'm really looking forward to what they have to say. But I thought I'd begin, Mr. and Mrs. Lormer, Tom and Becky, by just asking you a little bit about your background in parenting. Could you tell us about yourselves, about your children? And I'm just kind of a jump off in the deep end this morning.
You can go first.
Okay, I'm Becky. I was raised on a farm, and I have 4 other siblings. I am second. I have an older brother, and then 2 brothers younger and a baby sister. And being raised on a farm, I think shaped me a lot to what I am, because I didn't know it then, but we probably were poor. And so, but we had to pull together. We had to work together. If we did not pull together, we were not going to make it. There was too much work to do when you bale hay, when you feed the animals, when you plant, when you harvest. And I just felt like it was a great privilege for me, but it also taught me the value of family and pulling together, and that you always pull together. You never leave one out, just pull together. So I know that that has really flavored our perspective of a family and parenting, is that we're in this together and we're working together, and we're going to make this if we stay together. So rough times, so that's.
Well, and I think that's really neat, because it seems like in our day, a lot of people's attitude towards family is like, if things are going well, we'll work at it. If I see the future, if things are on the up and up, if the family's happy, and God forbid, but when a child has physical problems, or the marriage goes through a rocky stretch, or unfortunately we see so many people divorce or homes break apart. And so it's interesting that you kind of came from that background where you're like, on a farm, if everyone's not pitching in, it's just not going to work. And so that's neat. Mr. Lormer, your background a little bit?
Well, my background is a little different. I grew up in the west part of Chicago.
Not a farm.
Not a farm. Nope. In the city. And my father was a doctor. My mother was a nurse. She was a pediatric nurse. Had 10 children.
10, so, only 10. Why'd they stop then?
I don't know.
Probably your age.
Probably.
Yeah.
Anyway, so I have 8 siblings living, and grew up in a home where we had chores. We had to do those things, responsibilities, because there were a lot of us. And so things like dishes and trash, and we did our own laundry by the time we were in 6th grade. Taking care of making our own beds, keeping our rooms clean, doing all that kind of stuff, plus the outside chores, those kinds of things as well. So there was a lot of responsibility that was given, that we had to do. My parents were committed Christians, as are Becky's, and they wanted us in church, wanted us to be raised in a Christian home. That was extremely important to them. So a number of things that come from, my background that we bring forward as well, but one of them is, again, is a strong commitment to marriage and to family and to children, the importance of children.
How many children? Tell us about your family a little bit. I know them, I grew up with them, but tell us about how many children you have and the spread, the age, the age gaps and stuff like that.
Yep. We have 5 children. Our daughter is our oldest, and then we have 4 boys, and they are, let's see, ages.
They're basically 2.5 years apart, 3 years apart.
Okay.
Until our last one. And then Matthew, the gap there is an 8-year difference. And there is a long story there, but yes.
Right.
Well, and I'll give a little bit of background that's sort of funny. My father knew the Lormers back. My dad's family's from Iowa, and they were out ministering in Iowa, and so they made connections out there. And they have Amy, but then their boys are Steve, David, Daniel, and Matthew. And my parents named me David, and my brother's Daniel. And then my youngest brother, they named Steven. So we used to tell my parents, like, couldn't you get any more original? Did we have to copy the Lormers? I mean, but I guess Amy and Ruth, and then you've got an extra one in Matthew. But if my parents had another boy, I wouldn't be surprised if they copied you again. But so you both came from large families. Did you always know that you wanted to have a larger family? I guess 5 doesn't. By 100 years ago, or even Mr. Lormer's family standards, that's not a lot. But in our day, that seems like a lot. Did you always want to have 4 or 5 children, or?
We were discussing trying to go back 43 years, 44, 45 years. And we think that we did talk about probably having 4 children.
Okay.
If I remember correctly. So we did not talk about 10.
Okay. So. Well, we have 3, and I'm always talking about 4, and my wife is talking about 3. So.
Well, when we did our premarital counseling, Dr. Spies actually did it, and he wanted us to discuss how many we would want. And he said 4, and I said 3, and so we're at 3 right now. So we'll have to see how it turns out.
We didn't fight over it because I thought 3 and 4 aren't so far. If I wanted 12 and she wanted 2, that
would be different.
So.
That's true. And by the way, the 4th one added on to 3 is not much more.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. You're in my corner, Pastor.
Yes.
Just additional blessing.
Thank you, Pastor Tom. At my church, everyone teams up with her. So, so a question I wanted to ask you guys is how soon you began to talk about raising a family and children, because, I think for a lot of my families, they didn't come from homes where they were encouraged to think a lot about parenting. And so, they fell in love, they got married, and after 2 or 3 kids, it's like they woke up and suddenly they're thinking, oh man, I've got to raise this kid. I know that you tend to be a little bit more methodical, Mr. Lormer, and thought out. Did you talk about, children and maybe the size of your family or your parenting style or discipline? I mean, did you talk about that pretty early on? Was that something right after you were married? Was it when you were doing premarital counseling? I guess when did you start? Was parenting on your radar? For actually, I guess both of you could answer that. But
to be perfectly honest, we can't remember. And too long ago. I don't really think we talked a whole lot about parenting while we were dating, and I don't know that we did right after we got married either. Now, we were in the ministry. So one thing, when you're in the ministry, you're working with people and you are observing other families.
I don't know what you're talking about.
Yeah, someday you'll catch on.
Yeah, right.
Yeah. Anyway, so I'm sure that at some point we were making observations about homes, about families, and about those kind of things. So, but one of the things we wanted to do, we recognize that our children are a gift from God. They're not ours. And a baby dedication for our children was very significant because it really is we had to give them to God. That's what it is. And we're stewards of that responsibility for that life. So our children, we had a responsibility, primary responsibility, to raise them for the Lord. And that was, I think, both of us felt very strongly about that. And that then shaped a lot of our perspectives going forward in raising children. So we did not want to raise them by accident, but to raise them on purpose. So you're right, I am somewhat organized. And so we started, I don't remember exactly when we started either, probably not when Amy was real little, I'm not sure. But at some point in there, we started making an annual retreat for ourselves, where we would pass our kids off to grandma, and then we would meet and we would discuss what we wanted our family to look like. So we did that, developed goals for the family, and then we also said, well, how are we going to implement these? Now, if you have to have perfection or nothing, you'll get nothing.
You get nothing, yeah.
Right. So had to realize that, but we did set some goals through the course of the year of things that we would seek to accomplish. And then that also drove our budget. You can't, some things you got to pay for them. And so we would plan to pay for them. I've watched many parents who parent more by accident. They just take life as it is and, oh, well. We tried not to do that. We tried to be purposeful in raising our kids for the Lord, and also purposeful in trying to teach them to be independent leaders. And that was an intentional thing. Now, obviously, personalities matter, and we have to have the grace of God and help of God, and they have to have a good mom.
And the support of a husband, because I can remember days when Tom would come home and he would pick up on the tenor of what was happening in the house. And one of the things he would say, have you been speaking to your mother like this all day? And by the way, we homeschooled. And so the kids were home all day. And he would just be able to pick up right away what's going on here, and we're changing this. And so we definitely worked together. He was my big support, because when you're living in it like 8 hours a day, you don't necessarily pick up on what somebody else can see when they're coming in. So he was a great help. And again, because we knew we were in this together and we had the same goals and we evaluated those goals. My verse has always been, unless the Lord builds the house, we labor in vain that build it. And my heart's cry so many times was, Lord, I don't have time to read a book. I don't know how to find the answer to this, but you must help me. I have to have help. And my heart's cry was, there are so many children that are being raised for the enemy. And it just would my heart. I know my children have to make a choice, but we had a very, very strong goal that these were not our children. And I had a big responsibility. I still have a big responsibility to God, because these are for him and for his kingdom. And what a beautiful gift and privilege that we get to raise warriors for God's kingdom.
I like that. Something I wanted to tackle, we didn't talk about this ahead of time, but Mr. Lormer said something about raising his children to be independent. And it's subtle, but I think that in our culture, that's not the norm anymore. And I think that parents find so much meaning in their children that we almost live in a culture where parents are raising their children to remain dependent upon them. A little bit of an unhealthy codependency, because it makes the parents feel a certain way. And I just thought that was an interesting thing that you said. We wanted our children to be independent, rather than, not that you want to push them. It's like, hey, you turned 15, you better get a job and find a home. It's not that you're abusive or anything, but you also see that there's a horizon that you're looking at in which they're going to be fully functioning adults that no longer need you for survival. And I think that's, I don't know if you want to chime in on that at all, but when you said that, I thought that is something that in our day and age, probably we should talk about a little bit more.
Well, that comes partly out of my background. My father, that was, whether they had sat down and made that a goal or not, I don't know. But that was certainly the case. And we understood when we were growing up that we were headed out to be on our own. And I'll never forget the day that he dropped me off at college, first day at college. And because I knew that was a change in the relationship. And to be responsible so much more now for my own future. My parents loved me and we had a great relationship. It's not that they abandoned us or anything like that. But again, we had that understanding. We were headed out to be independent. And so one of the things about raising children, we want them to be the Lord's, and we want to be a part of multiplying. So that was part of the reason why I wanted to have more children, is because then that would be more Christians going forward. And if we could help, if the Lord would have to do it, obviously, because personalities really matter, but if we could help them to be leaders, Christian leaders who love the Lord, and that would make a great difference going forward, and it would replace us one day, but in a greater way.
Mm-hmm.
Part of our goal.
Yeah, definitely. Do you have anything you want to add to that, Caroline? She's just, you can say no to the camera. She's like whispering, no, don't look at me.
I understand that.
Something, and we kind of were already on this topic a little bit, but I don't know if there's anything that you'd like to add to what you said, but something I've seen in recent times is that children seem to be the center of the home. And, in my heart, it's like I know that that's not right. I think as a pastor, I want God to be the center of the home. And maybe some parents have trouble distinguishing the two, where it's like, well, I thought, God is the center of the home. But I see parents that almost seem like their purpose for existence is completely tied up in their children. And, you said that as a pastor, one of the things you get to do is witness other people raise their children. And this is going out to a lot of people that I've watched raise their children. So I'm not, I don't have anybody specifically in mind. I'm not sniping people. But I've noticed that parents that tend to live for their children, the children don't seem to turn out as well. I mean, I'm just being real.
Exactly.
And I don't know if you guys have anything you could speak to that, but it seems like children may be the single greatest responsibility we have besides our relationship with God. And yet when we make our lives when we build our lives around our children, it's like we can do no greater damage to them. It's almost like we have to structure our lives around the Lord and then pull our family in and make him the center of our lives too. And I'm speaking in very abstract terms, and I feel like I don't know if my people will even understand what I'm saying. But do you have any thoughts on what I'm saying, or maybe you can even more clearly articulate it if I've done a sufficient job of it?
One of the first things I would say is that children very rapidly pick up on who's in charge.
Yeah.
So for our kids, we wanted them to know there was no pitting mom against dad. Mom and dad were together and solid. So one of our things, it was very important that when we got married, that Tom and I bonded very strongly. So you need the marriage bond to be very, very strong. Children pick up on it before adults do. And they learn how to play back and forth. And if they learn that they are the center, then family is just in crisis always. But with us, when dad came home, they knew he was in charge. And then they also knew that mom and dad worked together. So that's my point on that. Very important key. And what would you?
Let me add something too that I think fits here. There was a book I read years ago by Paul Tournier. It's entitled Secrets. And it was extremely helpful to me. And I've shared it with many people and in my classes as well. That if we understand developmentally, when kids are little, they can't keep a secret. They'll take, the old program, really old now, Art Linkletter, and so on. You can get kids to saying it. They don't know how to keep secrets. And so they will tell everything and they'll run around without clothes on and, all that kind of stuff too. They just do that.
Your kids did that?
They did. Yeah, we fixed it. But anyway, part of growing up is the ability to learn to keep secrets. And part of what identifies a person as an individual is the ability to keep secrets. And then the third stage is being able to give or share secrets. And this allows the child as an individual to build relationships, because all relationships are based on shared secrets. When those secrets are shared voluntarily, you have a strong bonding, a strong bonding relationship. I have observed parents, like we say, when the kids are the center, lots of times the problem is that parents aren't letting their kids grow up. They don't allow their kids to keep secrets. And they're trying to force a friendship on their children, well, that actually results in many times in rebellion. The kids have an internal desire to be an individual. To be an individual means that I have to keep secrets. There are some things about me that I want to keep, and I want to choose who I share those secrets with. That's a part of maturity. And when that's hindered, the parents treat their children like they are 5 or 6 or 7 years of age, and you should tell me everything, and we're just going to be the best friends, and we won't have any secrets between us, and so on. That can lead to the child rebelling. And then the parent pushes that responsibility on the child, so the child's a rebellious child. Well, sometimes it's the parents that need to recognize what can be going on. Now, the great thing is when we allow our children, we lead them, we say, it's like Paul, follow me as I follow Christ. We give that example. We pray that they early turn to Jesus, that they live for Jesus, but we allow them to become their own individual. We don't compete with them. If they get better than us at something, that's fine. That's wonderful. We hope that'll be the case. We allow them to become an individual. And then when they share those secrets back with us, then we have a mature relationship. Let me just a story, if it's all right.
Yeah, go ahead.
It's an example of this. And this is, I've done marriage counseling, premarital counseling for years. And one of the things that I was very aware of is that when a couple gets married, they need to form a strong bond, just like what Becky said. In order to do that, it has to become a secret between them. And so when kids get married, they'll naturally pull away from their parents for a period of time because their focus is on each other. And I've told parents, just be patient. The grandkids will come along and they'll need you. So, it'll come back. But anyway, we went through the same thing with our own children. And they would get married and there'd be a period like, hey, don't they know how to use a telephone? It's don't hear from them. But they build their own home, their own foundation, and then they come back as it were. That's not that they were really, the relationship was never strained. It's just now it's a stronger voluntary relationship. And so as parents, we want to be careful during the teen years in particular that we are not pushing our kids away. And we can do that accidentally by not allowing them to grow up, not allowing them to become who they are. Now, along with this might be going down the sidetrack somewhat, but
No, it's good.
One of the things that has to happen with that too, and that is you give freedom to children when they demonstrate responsibility. Too many parents have it backwards. They give the freedom to the children and then hope they demonstrate responsibility. But actually, you give greater freedom based on a child's ability to handle the freedom they have responsibly. And as that happens, then they're not left without boundaries. They're not left without guidance. They're not said, okay, here, this is it. Now you figure out how to live. Let me just give you an illustration here, true story with one of ours. I won't say which one, but they were having a terrible time keeping their toys picked up and keeping their room clean.
I have that problem with Caroline. No, I'm just kidding.
Well, maybe I better stop this illustration.
Go ahead.
Anyway, dear old dad comes in and says to my child, this room has to get cleaned up and everything needs to be put away. And I gave them a time period to do it in.
And by the way, we had places for everything.
Yeah.
So they knew
where to go. And then I told them, I said, now this is what's going to happen. If things are not picked up and put away, I'm bringing a box with me, a big box, and everything that's not put away is going in that box. So I told them ahead of time, what are we going to do and why this was important? Well, I came at that time. I gave them enough time to clean the room, and guess what? There's stuff all over the place. I started loading in the box. They started crying. I didn't need to get upset. I didn't need to raise my voice or anything else. I said, now I want to explain to you what this means. This means that as a parent, I've given you too much freedom. It's my responsibility to teach you how to handle the responsibilities that you have and the freedoms that you have. I've given you too much. So we're going to pull this back until you can clean up your own room on your own, and you know how to do that. Now, here's the deal. If you want something that's in this box, you let me know, bring me another toy and we'll trade. And you know, we can do this, but these things are not coming back to you until you demonstrate that you can responsibly clean your room and take care of this. Now, that's a whole lot better situation than mom running in and picking up all the toys and cleaning it for them. That's not teaching responsibility. And then we give them freedom without a responsibility to go along with it, and then we're not teaching them to grow up. We're not teaching them to become responsible. We're not teaching them to become leaders.
And I think something that you said that is so good that we don't, boundaries. Like when we, and I'm on the front end, so I'm not pretending to have all the answers, but I think I see a lot of children who, you know, when they're misbehaving, it's like, here's an iPad, or, you know, here's a TV show, or, and the kid almost wanders through childhood never having clear boundaries articulated to them from the parents of, here's how I expect you to behave. Here are the clear consequences when you misbehave. And this isn't stuff that we had talked about ahead of time, but when I'm listening to you, I'm thinking it makes so much sense. And I would even say that children seem to be happier when they know what the boundaries are.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And you know, with Fletcher, the times that I get the most frustrated with him, and in turn he gets the most frustrated with me, are when he behaves in a way that I haven't told him not to, that I'm extremely frustrated with him for. But he's very frustrated because he didn't, maybe he knew in his conscience he shouldn't have been doing it, but I wasn't clear with him, and so he was sort of wandering in the wilderness and then got slapped for it. You know what I mean? Like his hand slapped. So that it's really interesting that you touched on it without even using that word, but the boundaries that we set for our children, the expectations we have for them. And I don't know, you, Caroline, do you deal with
Yeah, I think boundaries just help everything go a lot smoother. And so kind of what he said, Fletcher tends to be a rule follower in a lot of ways. And so if we can communicate things ahead of time, you know, what we expect of him, he's usually, you know, pretty good about following them. And then when he knows that he has followed them and he's respected his parents, then everything just seems to go a lot better. But
he's happier
yeah,
because he feels like, you know, he clearly knows the parents' expectations, so he feels pleasure when he stays within the boundaries that we've outlined for him.
Right. They need to know that their parents are pleased with them.
And this is a tangent, but I've told Caroline my, if I would say, philosophy of discipline, and I want to get to discipline next, but I've seen children that weren't disciplined enough and the consequences, and I've seen children that maybe you could argue they were disciplined too much and the consequences. And you know, it's kind of like, Lord, where am I supposed to be? And so my personal, where I've landed right now anyways, is I'm probably going to lean discipline heavy, but then use a lot of affirmation so that my child knows that it's coming from a heart of love. So for instance, I'm probably harder on my child than a lot of parents are, but when my kid acts appropriately or goes over and above, I'm really quick to do something for him, like spend some time or go get some ice cream, or, and I don't know if that's right or wrong, but it's like, obviously you'd want to be perfectly at the center, but that's never going to happen. And so I'm like, if I've got to lead one way, maybe I lean towards being not harsh, but firm, but then on the back end, come in with enough affirmation that my child never questions my motive. You know, I don't know. That's
And Mr. Warmer says, whatever you feed is what grows.
it grows.
Yeah.
And my people have heard that phrase before. So
Yeah, that's
Exactly right. Yes.
guys, you are looking at the real McCoy. That was not my, I give you credit too. So I want to go to discipline. It seems like discipline's a swear word in our culture. People are afraid to discipline. Maybe you could talk about why that is, why, because I think that worldview as it relates to discipline is a huge factor. What we believe matters. And but our culture at large tends to believe that children are perfect and discipline is squelching their personalities and keeping them down and oppressing. And So could you talk about the role that discipline needs to take in the life of the believer? And I'm a lover of the book of Proverbs, and it seems like every proverb has 2 or 3 verses on how parents need to discipline. And then we look at our culture who's dead set against it. Could you talk about that for just a minute?
Okay. Discipline. Let's see who's going first here. Discipline is extremely important. One thing we have to recognize is that the responsibility for children has been given to the parents. That's a biblical worldview. The children belong to the parents, not the state, not the school system. It is the parents' responsibility. That being the case, then, it's mom and dad who have to teach their children all kinds of things that maybe we'd rather have somebody else teach. For example, who's going to teach the children to respect their parents? Well, the parents need to do that. And we'd like to assign it to somebody else, say, well, we'll take them to Sunday school and let the Sunday school teach them to respect their parents. But it has to come from the parents. And we can't abdicate those responsibilities. And going on forward and other things, we can't just say, okay, well, the school system's going to fix our kids. Parents are responsible. That's where God has placed the responsibility. So we have to discipline them. And our discipline, we need God's wisdom. Well, I tell you, if any man lack wisdom, let him ask from God, who gives liberally and upbraideth not, or does not make fun of us. And I live in that verse in James, because you have to know, you have to have help, and you come into the situation. Wisdom is the application of knowledge. It's one thing to know principles about discipline. It's another thing to know, how do I apply it to this child of mine in the situation right now? And I'd love to tell you we did it perfectly, but we didn't. And everybody knows how to raise children until they have them. And then out that the kids are not necessarily the same. What worked with one, you think you got it figured out, and then the next child helps you be humble. You don't really know. So you have these general principles that have to be put into place, and that's what needs to be worked out between husband and wife, and say, this is what we're going to have in our home. For example, I just very, very frustrated with parents who only teach their kids how to count when they're upset. They tell them to do something, then they start counting. 1, 2, 3. You don't need
3.5.
Yeah, 3.5.
Yeah, right.
That is ridiculous. And what that demonstrates is the parents don't have control of their children, and their children know at what point. I can tell you the story about a woman who had come to me one time for advice on, she's having trouble with her child. This is a small child. He's probably 6 or 7 maybe. And while she was in my office, he was out playing in our sandbox, which was next door. She got finished and went out the door, and I went to the door, and she's headed down the steps, and she hollers at her son, and she says, calls him by name, I don't remember his name now, and says, okay, it's time to go now. Let's head to the car. He didn't even look up. He just kept playing in the sandbox. And so she got louder. And I don't think he was deaf. I think he heard it the first time. But anyway, then she said it again. Then she started counting. She got to 3, but this time he had looked up at her. He hadn't stopped. And she said to me, see what I mean? I said, yeah, I see exactly. The problem's not with the son.
Yeah.
The problem's with mom.
Yeah.
If what you're doing is just teaching your kids that they don't have to listen to you the first time. Now, I tell parents, don't say something you don't mean. Okay. If you don't mean it, don't say it. Don't direct it to them. But if you mean it, then you expect them to obey immediately. No counting. You don't need to holler. You don't need to do those kind of things. We train them how to respond to us. And so if you could set it right there at the beginning, when we say something, this is what we mean, and this is what we expect to have happen, or there will be consequences. The child learns that, and they learn how to respond.
And when they're young, and again, Tom and I would discuss these things and like, okay, it's not working. We need to come up with something else. So one of our children, Tom calls it, they would have committee meetings. And so I could say something to him. We knew that they heard us. We knew that they weren't disobeying, but there was a disconnect. And one of the things that did work for us is I would say, look at me, look at my eyes. And once I knew that they could see my eyes and I could see them, and then I would repeat it, this is what I said to you, then they could connect with me because they saw my eyes. It wasn't just a voice out, in the wilderness, but they actually saw, connected, and then they were expected to obey. So I do understand why parents learn to count. It's their way of trying to get their child's attention, but I think there are better ways to get attention. And also, one of the things I would like to say is children will be no more disciplined than their parents are.
Yeah, that's true.
So if children are undisciplined, basically what I say, you know what, then the parents are undisciplined. And then we need to look at ourselves.
Yeah, and you were saying that I read a book by a Jewish rabbi, and he said that in the Jewish, and of course he comes from a Judeo-Christian perspective, but the Jewish end of the Judeo side of it. But he said that Jewish people don't have as hard a time teaching their children about authority because from infancy, the children has witnessed their parents submit to God's authority.
Exactly.
And he said, when we read the Bible or the rabbi says something to us in correction, or we submit, and so when our children ask us why we do something, when we say because God wants us to, what we're doing is we're subconsciously laying a foundation, an understanding of how authority works in their life, that when we ask them to do something, they don't question our authority because we have allowed God to lead us. And I thought that's really good because I think, a lot of parents, they sort of rationalize disobedience to God in areas of their life, and then they can't understand why their children or teenagers or adults rationalize disobedience to them in areas of their life. And I just, when that guy said that, I thought that's probably on point, and it's exactly what you're saying. And my brother Daniel and I, we were talking about, he said, I don't want Emery to grow up. He's got a little baby girl named Emery. I don't want Emery to grow up and be on her cell phone all the time. And he's like, which is kind of scary because that's what I do a lot of time with my free time. And that's just a practical example. We've got to live out what we want our children to.
Yes.
And kids will be able to figure out what's important to you. You can tell them one thing, but they see how we live.
Mm-hmm.
What a parent sacrifices for, the child knows is important. Example, we can say it's important to go to church as a family, and our kids are going to go. But if our children won't necessarily believe that until they see that it costs us, and we are willing to pay that cost. But if we're only going to church when it's convenient, our kids pick that up. Only important when it's convenient. That's true that area. It's true in other areas as well. If well, you can apply it in all kinds of places, financial ways or in obedience or in lots of different ways. But they'll watch, and they'll learn what is important to us by what we sacrifice for, what we're willing to put first in our lives. They'll see it, and then they know that that's what's really important.
That's really good.
Yeah, that can be true of our personal devotions. We had a podcast last week about talking about our spending time with the Lord in devotions. And I was saying that we want to make sure that it's a priority in our lives as individuals, because then our kids will see we don't just say that the Bible is important, and we don't just say that it's important to read the Bible, but they are seeing it in our lives. So.
Mm-hmm.
Very true.
I wanted to ask you, actually, this is a question Caroline had written down, but she had asked why it's important for families to regularly attend church. I would broaden that a little bit probably and say, you've already addressed it, teaches them priorities. But what were some other mechanisms, ways that you passed on your Christian values to your children? Because I believe the goal of every parent ought to be to have a fully functioning, mature, independent adult at some point, that serves the Lord. How do you, that's probably like define God and give 3 examples. That's really probably an impossible, but were there some specific things that you identified as being things that were passing on values? Attending church was one, but some other things that you modeled for your children.
Well, that was has to be written right into your life. And so, we had 21 rules of the home, which were based on Christian principles. We had devotions. We had Christian artwork in the house. We had an emphasis on those things Christ-like. It has to be a part of life. It was not an addition. You know, it wasn't just on Sundays we do this and the rest of the week is different. It's a part of everything all the time. Children are in different levels of development, and so it can be challenging. You have to adjust to what the kids can understand, but they can understand about prayer. But before our kids could read, we made placemats, and for people to pray for, we have their pictures and we put them in the placemat.
There were pockets.
Pockets, yeah, there were pockets in the placemats that we made. And unfortunately, I've never figured out how to get 7 onto a piece of paper. So they only had 6 pockets. But anyway, so through Saturday. And I guess Sunday was a church day, it was okay. But anyway, so then we put the prayer request, a picture that they could see, and we put that in for Monday and Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday through the week. And so that was a way for little kids. You have to try to be, especially me, because I'm used to working with adults, and have been in youth ministry. But what do you do with kids? So trying to find ways to bring Christian living down to their level, practical part of their level. And I think there's a lot of ideas today that are available more so than when we were doing it. You can find things on Pinterest and various places, things that would help kids to see this is a part of who we are, and it's a part of our family and a part of our life. What do you want to add to that?
Can't think of anything more to add right now.
No, that's really good. You mentioned something about different stages of life. I can't remember the exact wording you used about 2 or 3 minutes ago, something about the levels that they're at. And I kind of wanted to talk to you briefly about parenting through the different stages. And we're on the front stage, and so I'm dealing with a 4-year-old, a 2-year-old, and an infant. And I'm giving the infant a pass at least for a while, but the 2 and the 4-year-old, we're actively trying to parent. But I've got a lot of people in my church that have preteens, and I've got teenagers in my church, and then adults even. And I thought maybe if you could talk a little bit about parenting as they go through as they kind of go through the different stages and how that parenting changes over time. Could you just, I don't know, I feel like I'm asking really broad questions, but I'm giving you a big bullseye. How's that?
Maybe we can hit it then.
Yeah, right.
That was a part of what it meant to grow as parents, though, too, because we didn't know. You don't know what you're doing with a 1-year-old, and then you get a 4-year-old, and then you get a 6-year-old, an 8 and a 10. And every place you're having to ask the Lord for wisdom. The other thing is the boys and girls are not the same. I that they are, and that's a big lie from the devil. But you have to recognize that. And so boys and girls are different. Girls develop some things faster, and expectations. When Becky referred to the committee meeting, that's boys. Boys have a mental committee meeting. If you give them a list of 3 or 4 things to do, they'll do the first one. Then the brain has a committee meeting and they forget the rest. It's not that they're being rebellious. And so we had to learn to adjust. You tell them one thing to do and then come back and see me. You can have a girl and you can tell her 2 or 3 things to do and she'll do them all. You have to understand that there are those differences. And then working with your children, their personalities as well. I will say this, and it's unpopular. So I'm just going to say it. You might have to, edit this part.
We'll cut this out. Go ahead.
But if you're going to win the battle in Christian parenting, you have to control the media. Far too many kids today are growing up being trained and schooled by the media. And parents just let them. They've got TVs and computers in their rooms, their bedrooms. They've got their cell phone in the bedrooms. There's no control over the information and the stuff that is feeding them. And then we wonder why they look like the world. They're going to look like the world. That media is going to have to be controlled. And I know it's unpopular today. And I know that kids will say, yeah, but all my friends and that kind of stuff. We'll give an example. As I said, it's not going to be popular. But our desire is that for our children is to raise them as Christians, and we wanted them to have a solidly Christian worldview. So we did not have network television in our home. We did not want to use the TV as a babysitter. It's an easy thing to do. Just watch this program, you know, and that'll occupy them so I can do something that I need to do as an adult that's constructive and so on. Well, that's really dangerous, because all we're doing is teaching them to pay attention, to be entertained by that stuff. Now, that meant that early, we're going back a lot of years, you know, the videotapes, but we could screen the videotapes, and we would know the content. And so then we had a TV, it was hooked to the VCR, and, you know, we could play those things. It wasn't that we were against entertainment, but you got to control the media. If you don't, they end up being exposed, and it's the worldview that is so devastating. And they don't pick that up through logical analysis. They pick it up through entertainment, and then they absorb it instead of thinking it through. And then it just becomes a part of that. So I think Christian parents have to be very serious and very committed to controlling the media of children, and have to be willing to be old fuddy-duddies, you know, at some point, particularly with preteen and teenagers. We made it a policy that when our kids went to somebody else's home, if they were going to watch any kind of a movie, we needed to know what that movie was ahead of time. And our kids knew that. And so they would go someplace and somebody would say, well, how about if we watch this movie? And our kids would say, well, we can't do that without checking with our parents. You'd be surprised. Here's an instance, an example where they were going to do that. And so our child found out what movie it was, came back and told me. So then I just looked it up on a review. And I'm thinking, no, we don't want you watching this. This is not good. And I could explain to him right then, say, what this has got swearing in it, this many times, it's got scenes in here. These are not kinds of things we want you putting into your mind. Now, to be perfectly honest, that other home was a Christian home. But I was telling my son, we don't want you to be entertained by these kinds of things. There's better entertainment than that. So that, I think, is a key thing in raising children who are going to love the Lord. You got to control the media.
Yeah, and I think part of the reason for this podcast is I feel like there are so many voices out there right now that you can entertain yourself indefinitely. And, you hop in the car and you can listen to the radio, and you get home and you can flip on the television. And if you're waiting in a doctor's office, you can pull up YouTube on your cell phone, and on and on and on it goes. And what you have is you have kids and teens who are getting 35 minutes to an hour of spiritual teaching on a Sunday morning every week. And they're having 20 to 30 hours of education in secular things throughout the week. And I feel like part of the reason for this podcast is I just want to put Christian wholesome thinking stimulation out there, because, I'll just give you an example, but we're going to be talking about Christian dating at some point. We want to have a podcast on that. Most of my teens have probably seen 300 episodes of Friends. And, they're sleeping around with this person or that person, or, it's completely normal to fall in love and then fall out of love and maintain some kind of a close friendship with somebody you used to, sleep with. And so, like, I can tell them what God's word says, and then they go out, and the word brainwash sounds strong, but it's probably not too far off. They're being brainwashed by media and by culture, so that it's completely undermining and nullifying everything I'm trying to teach them. And I think that there has been a little bit of a disconnect, to your point, between parents who are like, I want my child to do right. I'm going to give them this computer or this cell phone or this, cable in their room, dish network in their room, and they don't see the impact that it's having on their mind. And right. So I think that's phenomenal. Do you have anything to add to that, Mrs. Lormer?
It starts very early. One of the things, so as parents, again, the parents need to be the most disciplined on this and checking ourselves. One of the things that our family, I believe we were probably watching it together. It was a very early Disney on Pinocchio. But one of the scenes in it was when one of the characters just bared their bottom and defied authority. And immediately in my spirit, I'm like, okay, I do not want my kids acting like that. So we can't watch this, because kids will pick up. That's what they will do. You know, in the movie, it was funny. You know, everybody laughs. You know what? That is not funny. And we are not even going to be a part of something that's supposed to be for children, geared for children. And I think often we can quickly say, oh, it's one little tiny scene. What will that matter? But for me, that mattered. So for parents, I just think that if their hearts are, Father, show me. I want to be very aware of how children see things.
Yeah.
And then for us to pick up on it and be the boundary, again, the boundary setters, the boundary protectors for them, for us, but as well as for them. And like my husband said, there's better stuff out there. You probably have to look a little bit further, but yes, you can find it. It is there. So you can replace it, not just make it empty, just like nothing. Okay, you can't watch anything, but there is something better. We're gonna do something. We're gonna replace it with something better.
And it might cost something, but write it into the budget.
Mm-hmm.
Hmm.
Yeah. I was actually thinking, I think it's important for parents to realize that they shouldn't feel guilty either for having those standards for their children. You know, they might compare themselves to other parents. That happens a lot. I think moms compare themselves to other moms a lot and think, well, you know, this mom thinks it's okay. But it's okay as parents to say, these are the standards we're going to have for our children, and not back down, because ultimately I think you'll be grateful in the long run that you did hold to those standards, and not allow other people to kind of influence your choices for your own family.
I wanted to segue just a little bit and talk about parenting in tough times. And this morning we shared with us right before we started the podcast, but Clara woke up at what time this morning?
3:45.
At 3:45 this morning, and she didn't go to bed for close to 2 to 3 hours, and she was screaming and opening the door, slamming doors. She'd be disciplined and put back in bed, and she'd get up. And Fletcher's our rule follower. Clara is not. And when she wakes up in the middle of the night and she's ready to go, I mean, she's ready to have breakfast. This is just kind of, we're dealing with toddlers and stuff. But as you progress through parenting, I know the grief that I caused my parents as a teen. I know, if you have adult children that aren't serving the Lord at different times, it can be very difficult, and probably, I would imagine, feel very helpless, especially, when you've got teens that aren't serving the Lord, or maybe they're bucking against that authority that they readily accepted as young people. How do you conduct yourselves? And I guess, you had 5 children. I don't know which is which or whatever, but I'm sure there were seasons where some of them gave you grief. How do you parent and lead in those difficult times? You just shut the closet door and get inside and pray hard? I mean, how far do you push and address the issue? I know, again, I'm asking very broad questions, but I'm just looking for a little bit of wisdom for that parent out there that's like, I agree with you, I want to parent, but I'm going through a hard time with one of my children and I just feel helpless.
That's a good question. And the realities of life are that our children have independent spirits. And so you can't rubber stamp them. They can make choices, and they can make good choices, they can make bad choices. I mean, obviously want to try to reinforce the good ones, but when they make bad ones, then it becomes a real challenge and a real difficult kind of thing to happen. One of the things I think is the importance of godly friends of the parents. So you're not in it all by yourself. Sometimes from the outside, they can see things a little differently, and we have some good friends of ours who our kids would talk to, and I had utmost confidence that what kind of information, the kind of advice that they would get, and that kind of thing. But some of them we never found out about it till years later. And that was okay, because we had people, we weren't in it by ourselves. And there were people who supporting us, but they're also supporting our kids. And I think this is part of what the church is supposed to be.
Yeah.
So you've got people that have common values, common concerns, and I'm not just concerned about my kids, I'm concerned about your kids, I'm concerned about their kids. And we're going to try to point them in the right direction. And sometimes kids become frustrated with their parents over something. They can go to somebody else. Well, I hope we've already laid some foundation that the people they go to are people who are going to point them in a Christian manner, point them to Christ. I know that doesn't solve everything, but again, part of the fellowship of the church is important. So it's important to parents as well, and to share that we're not alone, and God can work through other people who pray for us when we just get tired of praying and know what else to do, and say, Lord, these are your kids. You better do something with them. So I think that's, again, a part of the important ministry of the church and the fellowship of believers, whether it's a small group or whatever it may be, of the influence and of the friends, that our friends would positively influence our children. Outright rebellion, one thing I think that parents have to continue to be together on a team with a oneness, and that we're going to hold these values. And then we may need to ask the Lord, how can we find a creative way to direct our kids into something in a better direction? Now, again, my wife said parents have to be disciplined. That's true, because sometimes you can't. See, how would I say it? Well, one of the things you can run into is you can have an older child who's really good at things, okay? And the next one comes along trying to catch up to that, but this one's always ahead. So they go in a different direction. Well, if we can know that ahead of time, and we don't say, well, why can't you be like your older brother or sister or whatever? Don't do that. Instead, we try to find what clicks with them that'll be different from here so they can succeed in their own right. And then when you've got more kids, there's more of that. You've got to be creative, but trying to help our kids to succeed in the area where they're interested, which may not be what I'm interested in. It may not be what their older brother or sister's interested in. I was so impressed with a layman in my church years ago whose son, junior high, said, I'd really like to learn to play chess. His dad didn't know how to play chess, but his dad decided they'd learn together. And they do something that the son wanted to do that was different than what his other siblings were doing to be a success in that area. So the dad was willing to adjust his own schedule and make the changes to be a part of helping that to happen. We live such busy lives that can be a challenge. And if that's the case, then I think we're too busy. So one of the things about parenting, Christian parenting, is that the parents have to be willing to sacrifice. We're going to sacrifice time. We're going to sacrifice money. If it's just making money as our goal, our kids will pick that up. But if we're willing to forego something in order to make something happen for them, they'll know that. They'll see. If they're interested in something, we can just say to them, we don't have money for that, which really isn't true. What it means, we make choices about how we spend our money, and that's just a cop-out when we say to our kids, we don't have money for that. Actually, to be honest, we need to say, well, we've chosen to spend our money this way and not spend it this way. But sometimes with our children, we need to spend money for what they're interested in, where they can feel successful, where they can achieve. And that may mean that we have to set something that we're interested on hold.
We're going to have to clip this section out too, Caroline. This is
I was actually just thinking about that. I was thinking I would love for our kids to have music lessons and at least give them that opportunity. But, it will take some sacrifice to invest in that. But, I want them to be able to grow in areas that they would be passionate about. And
I didn't mean to cut you off. I'm just giving you a hard time.
That's a good example. We
really
wanted
good.
Our kids to have a love of music. We wanted to take them to concerts. We wanted concerts to be fun and not boring. So to try, one of the things we decided to do is when we would take our kids to concerts, we would always go out for ice cream afterwards. So if the concert was bad, at least the ice cream was good.
Well, and I happen to have a little insider information on this, but your first four children played classical instruments. Your last one, Matthew, is into bluegrass. And many people in the church know Pastor Ryan and how he likes bluegrass, and he and Matthew were in a group together. And can you talk a little bit? I mean, this it wasn't where I was planning on going, but since we're kind of already going down this path a little bit, how maybe you can just tell him a little bit about Matthew, but his interests were so different than the other four. And I'm not picking on Matthew. He would admit that too, he wouldn't be offended. But, your first four, at least the boys, the first three are pretty good into technology and IT and stuff. And Matthew comes along and he's got an entrepreneurial spirit.
He's cleaning people's cars.
He's cleaning, he's detailing cars. And it's just like, it's like, is this even our child? You probably felt like that sometimes just because of how different he was. But you've already said, one size doesn't fit all and you have to find interest in stuff. But you kind of outlined it in an abstract way. And I just thought it was, if you could sort of talk about how you had to learn to parent differently to the different children based on their interests and even aptitudes. Matthew naturally had some aptitude, and so you encouraged it rather than trying to fit him into the mold of his older siblings.
And you've actually chosen two good examples. We'll go with the music. You may not know that actually Matthew started playing the trumpet, and so he can play the trumpet as well. But then his interest went into bluegrass music, that kind of thing. So what did it mean? One of the things it meant is that our other kids learned to play bluegrass instruments as well. And so did Dad. So that's when I learned to play the double bass.
For Christmas, they went together and got Dad a double bass because they knew he would learn it.
It meant I sacrificed the time to learn an instrument I don't know, so that I can be a part of that. Then one of the things I wanted to do, along that interest, and you've probably seen the video, wanted to make a music video. So I get the boys together and say, this is what we're going to do. And so we made that music video. It's out on YouTube. That's a long time ago. But anyway, again, to pull the family together in a different direction. That's not the direction we would have gone. On the entrepreneurial side, when Matthew started washing cars and that kind of thing, I'll tell that story. Is that all right? Anyway, we're at the store. Matthew'd gone off, and he comes back with these air fresheners, auto air fresheners. And his mother says to him, what are you going to do with these? And he said, I'm going to sell them. And she said, well, nobody wants an air freshener, pay for an air freshener. They can buy them themselves. And I just said, wait a minute. One of the principles we live by is freedom to fail. We give our kids the opportunity to try and fail. And if they fail, we don't cut them down. You learn from failure. That's how you develop maturity. So here's a step. It's his money. It's what he's going to do. Okay, fine. Let him buy it. I don't know how young he was. He was pretty young.
Oh, probably 7.
Yeah. We still have some auto air fresheners in our garage that belong to Matthew that never did get sold. So if you need one.
Yeah. If anyone in the church needs an air freshener, there's time to redeem their son's ambition.
And then I was able, once I caught the vision of where they were going, then I thought it was important. I thought it was important then for me to invest in him. But I have a very hard time with air fresheners. They make me literally sick to my stomach. And so I tried to find something then that I thought would be for people like us. And then when Matthew found something, like I bought it, like, Matthew, I want to buy that. Would you do that? Detail our car, and then here's money and put this in our car. So yeah, we learn. Parents are going to learn at the same time.
Yeah, I think it's interesting because we started out by talking about how you don't want to build your life around your kid. And we're kind of ending by talking about how parents need to sacrifice for their children. And I think that sometimes it's hard for us to reconcile both those. But I think that there is probably a middle ground in which we build our lives around the Lord, but we sacrifice enough for our children that they see that they are important to us. Even if they're not primary in our lives, they're secondary to the Lord. And maybe it's not an either or, it's probably something where we love the Lord so much that our family is important. That's probably a better, but that we sacrifice and we show our kids our love and care for them by allowing them to fail and by investing in things that they care about. And so all of that's been really, really good. Caroline, we've gone for over an hour. I don't want their ears to bleed. This has all been so good. Do you have any final questions you want to ask them in parting?
Yeah, I know you all mentioned something earlier when you all were talking about beginning your family and stuff. You said that you realized your children didn't belong to you. I think sometimes when we look at parenting, like from a worldly perspective, a lot of times we see our kids as like they belong to us, and so either they're going to bring us a lot of joy and bring us a lot of happiness, or they're going to be a big inconvenience and they're just going to irritate us all the time. And I think sometimes when we view our children that way, as possessions that belong to us, and our reaction to them and how we deal with them is based on how we feel about them at the time. I think a lot of times that affects our parenting in a negative way. And so I kind of wanted to ask you all to kind of flesh out maybe what it looks like to view parenting from a biblical worldview, to see our children not just as things that belong to us, but kind of how God views parenting and children.
The first thing that comes to my mind there is that our children were a gift to us, and they were a God-given responsibility, but more of a gift and a treasure, and that we would be responsible back to God. We had to give an answer back to God of how we parented and what we did. So my first view was always first for God. I have a responsibility to God. But the other thing that I hope that it did for me, I want to be very careful here, but we saw parents losing children, and how do you put that together? You know, how do you emotionally deal with that? And knowing that was always a possibility, but again, always trying to keep in mind, okay, I have no guarantees here. God is giving us this child for maybe a moment, and just to always treasure that as a gift and not as a right.
Yeah.
And let me just add something. I think it's important, especially for young moms of young children, to release them from guilt. And as a pastor, I can make moms of young children feel guilty, not necessarily because I want to or I'm trying to, but one of the things that is true is that young children and babies don't necessarily sleep the night through. And they don't, you say, I would like to have my devotions right now. So, your 2-year-old says, okay, mommy, that's fine. I'll keep myself occupied. Yeah, it doesn't happen. And you can make plans. You can have them all committed to the Lord. And then the washing machine throws up, and the kids do too. And it's all thrown out of kilter. And we can really, I think moms can browbeat themselves and say, well, I'm just not doing a good enough job, and God does not pleased with me, and I'm a hopeless mess, and it's whatever. In fact, I think that's one of the reasons why it discourages moms from having more children. We need to come alongside as the church, as pastors, and as husbands, and say, you know what? It's okay. It's all right. The Lord understands this too. And so if you can't have your devotions today, it's not the end of the world. And if you can't, do that, make that pie you wanted to make for a friend, it doesn't work out, we don't have to feel guilty about that. And somehow I think it's important for husbands to release their wives from that kind of guilt and to support them and help them to know things don't always go well. They don't always go smoothly, and we can have rough days when we do, and things look, man, alive. I think it's important for the husband to come in and say, honey, you're doing a great job. I really appreciate the way that you're working with our kids. Just want you to know how much it means to me. I think it's important to have that affirmation. And I think that's an important responsibility of the husband to provide that affirmation and release their wives from guilt over the stuff that's false guilt.
That's really, really good. And so one more thing I wanted to kind of maybe hit on, and you've addressed it a little bit, but growing up in the church that you pastored, and then being in your classes in college, one of the things that you said a lot was, what if the purpose of marriage is holiness and not happiness? You didn't phrase it. I think you usually said something like, what if it's to be holy and not happy, or, whatever. But I think, not that you're not happy in marriage, that sounded really bad. But I think that that's a little bit at play in parenting too. And we go into it, and yes, children bring us an incredible amount of happiness and wholeness and joy. And yet we've got to also understand that it is something that God is using in our lives, and it's not always pleasant, and it's not always fun. And you were just talking about the difficult times that moms go through. And Caroline and I had plans of getting up at 5 o'clock this morning and reading our Bibles, and we had set our alarms. Well, about 4:30, when a baby's screaming, and we went and crashed for an hour and a half after we finally got Claire in bed. But realizing it that whole time, God is using it to make us better people and more Christ-like. And not to beat a dead horse, but when we do have children that rebel, and when we do have, it's almost giving us a window into the heart of God that suffers for his children when they rebel. And so all through marriage, it's beautiful how God uses something that does bring us an incredible amount of joy in a very profound way to make us more Christ-like. And so I don't see parenting as a burden. It does have its days. Before we started this podcast, Caroline looked at me, and her look said it all. She's like, just want to go lay down. But I'm so thankful that God has made me a better man of faith for having Fletcher, Clara, and Addie. And God used your children to make you the people that you are in Christ. And so, anyways, I just want to give an encouragement to my families and my parents out there to hang in there. Maybe we've talked about something and you're feeling incredibly guilty because you didn't do what the Lormers did or what we're talking about. If God has spoken to you, maybe just get alone and have a word of prayer and say, God, give me the grace and wisdom and the strength to do what's right moving forward. It's no point in feeling guilty about things that have happened in the past, unless it's motivating us for the future, but that God would make us the parents that he wants us to be. And what I long for personally is I want my church people to have children that become board members in the future, and have children that raise their grandchildren to serve the Lord. And so this podcast isn't meant to fix everyone's problems. And, you listen to this and then your kids are going to be who's who and, valedictorians and vice chairs and their boards in their church, but that this might give you some practical tools. And so thank you, Mr. and Mrs. Lormer, for all your help. Would you mind doing Caroline and I a favor and sort of closing out this time by saying a prayer for us?
What's that?
Did you get that? Oh, would you close this time out by saying a prayer? Can't hear me?
Say it again one more time.
Okay.
Internet is cutting.
Okay, I said, would you be able to close with a prayer for us and for our church people, that God would help us as we parent our children? We cut out, or did you get that?
I think we got it. It's kind of breaking up here. So you'd like for me to pray for you and for your church family and your church people, and for the parents especially. Is that correct?
Yes.
All right. Sure. Let's pray. Our gracious Heavenly Father, we are so thankful that you understand each person. Lord, you know those who are listening to this right now, and some may be very discouraged in the midst of some tough situations. Some may just be at the beginning, starting. Some may not have children yet. But in every situation, Lord, I pray that they will look to you as the one who provides wisdom. May they see their children as a gift from you, and that you care more about their kids than they do. And you have more invested in their kids than they do. And I pray, Lord, that early those children will come to know you as their personal Savior and make decisions to live for you as disciples of Christ. And I pray as a church, I pray for Brother Spee's church, as a people together, they would be an encouragement to one another and a challenge to one another, a source of creative ideas and help going forward. And all of this is for your honor and for your glory, that our children may be presented to you as those that you would be proud of, and that you would work through to continue the kingdom business going forward. So we thank you so much for this time we've had this afternoon. and just talking about these things. Would you just use your spirit to take what needs to be said to those who are hearing and make those connections and help them to grow forward? We pray this, and we pray that you be with Pastor Spies and his wife Caroline and their family as well. We know that they're in a position where people are watching them. And so I pray you give them great wisdom. I pray that you would give them their children for Christ. And I pray that you would strengthen their marriage and their family, and that you would be honored through their lives and ministry. We pray these things in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen. Thank you all so much. God bless.
The Lord bless
Thank you much.
Bye.
Mhm.
Thank you.